And we're back now with Governors Ed Rendell of Pennsylvania, Jennifer Granholm of Michigan, Mark Sanford of South Carolina, and Tim Pawlenty of Minnesota. In the last 13 days, Timothy Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, announced the outline of his financial rescue plan. The President signed the stimulus plan. He offered his foreclosure plan, and the markets kept going down and down and down 900 points. Governor Rendell, why isn't the financial community buying the Obama program?
Well, that's tough to say, Chris, and I think there's a general pessimism here in the country, and it's time for some people to step up. I think, look, are each of the plans perfect? Of course not. We hear attacks on the stimulus bill. I've been in politics 31 years, and I haven't seen a perfect bill yet. But I think the Obama administration is taking action to solve this country's problems, and contrast it to what went before, when the Bush administration was absolutely paralyzed, did nothing. I think action is important. I think these plans are headed in the right direction. Again, almost all of the economists who have looked at this say it's necessary. Mark Zandi, who was Senator McCain's economist, said you can't let the system collapse, and what we're doing on housing is important.
Governor Sanford, there is growing talk, even from one of your senators, Lindsey Graham, about possibly nationalizing the banks. Some of the most troubled institutions, if only as a temporary measure. You talk about creative destruction, Adam Smith's line. No circumstances under which the government should come in and take over on a temporary basis some of these really troubled banks, the biggest banks?
I mean, with all due respect to the federal government, the idea that the group that ran the Katrina rescue would come in and run the banking system of this country,
well,
I think is...
Gone.
We got a new group
all
in
right,
town.
we're doing the R&D thing here. But anyway, I just think that it would be awfully tough because, with all due respect, again, the folks in Washington, they don't have a whole lot of financial
So what do you mean by creative destruction?
What I mean is there are literally thousands of small businesses that fail every year across America. And yet that process of discipline in the marketplace, of some making it because they meet a customer need or they have a great product and some not making it, is part and parcel to the way that our system works. And if you take that out for banks or for other folks, I think you have a much bigger problem. And I think that the real thing that the market has been signaling here is what they don't like is one series of ad hoc after ad hoc after ad hoc stimulus and bailouts, because effectively what they've done is they've frozen up the biggest driver of our economy, which is private capital, because nobody has any idea what the rules are going forward.
Speaking of bailouts, two of the big three, Chrysler and General Motors, came to Washington this week, Governor Granholm, and asked for another $21 billion in emergency loans. The companies still haven't resolved all their issues with the unions and the bondholders. They still haven't shown a clear path to solvency. Why should the taxpayers keep them on life support?
First of all, let's be clear. This is a loan. It's a loan that they are attempting to prove viability so they can pay it back. When this happened with Chrysler before, Chrysler paid it back. The taxpayers actually won. But they did present
$1 billion.
Right, but it was a different time, too, and a different circumstance, and it didn't happen during the course of a major national meltdown. This problem is the problem of with the auto industry is layered upon the lack of consumer confidence. People are not buying cars. I don't care whether they're American cars or international cars. My pal here from South Carolina, who I think is a bit, I mean, you'd have to say he's a bit of an outlier in terms of economic theory. He's somebody who is more of a libertarian than the rest of us, or most folks, would say that this creative destruction would be good. Every single country that has an auto industry is stepping forward to help that auto industry. Why wouldn't we help this industry too? Because it needs 3.5 million jobs. You talk about a stimulus that's supposed to save or create 3.5 million jobs? Well, we would just take that whole thing away. Communities all across the country, from Michigan to South Carolina to Minnesota, would be seeing devastation.
Let me bring in the outlier here, Governor Sanford, because you have a BMW plant in South Carolina, which is, I think, is not asking for any federal help. So tell Governor Granholm why residents of your state don't want to keep bailing out her companies.
One, I'd say I don't know that I'm an outlier. I think I'm really more fitting with where Main Street is, because when I talk to people back home at a town hall meeting, what they overwhelmingly tell me is, I'm not getting a bailout. I don't understand why everybody else is getting a bailout. I would say with regard to automotive companies, there's some structural things that have to change for them to be competitive going forward. Some things that the BMWs and other companies across this country and across the world have done that, with all due respect to GM, they haven't done. And the idea of throwing in money so you take away that pressure that would force the reform essential to their long survival, I think short-term in perspective.
You could make a generalization that they haven't done this. I'm telling you that we are the poster child state for this reform that has been going on. We have lost over 400,000 jobs in Michigan just from the vast majority of it related to the auto industry because of the restructuring that they have been undertaking. To say that they aren't doing that or that the plans that they have you read them? You probably haven't read those plans. You don't know what they have taken on. I am telling you that they have taken on enormous efforts to restructure. What they need during this recession is a bridge to be able to make them viable. And do we want in this nation to lose the backbone of manufacturing in this country? Do we want to be a nation that doesn't want to manufacture anything? Because this industry, with all of the thousands of parts...
I want to bring in Governor Pawlenty, who's been sitting here. Where do you come down on the auto bailout?
Clearly, the auto industry needs to be restructured. It cannot continue on its current platform in its current form. And the reason that the unions and the other stakeholders have not cut a deal with the automakers is because they believe the federal government, not enough, federal government is going to bail them out. And so the best way to get this thing restructured, I believe, is in the bankruptcy court and to have the federal government continue to plow money into this. Well, Jennifer, let me just finish, though. The unions and the auto companies have been unable to put a deal together that fundamentally restructures the industry. It needs to get done. The only way it's really going to get done is in bankruptcy court. They should have done it 6 months ago. They should do it now.
Governor Pawlenty, have you read the report that they have just submitted? I bet you haven't.
No, but
they have. Look, wait. Let me just respond to this because the unions have made enormous concessions. They have starting wages have taken 50% pay cut. Don't tell me that they haven't done that.
How about their retiree health fund?
Well, and their retiree health fund. So what do you want to do about this? Every other country is providing health care to their companies. We do not. So we are already asking our businesses, not just the auto industry, but other industries that are competing in a global economy to start 50 yards behind everybody else. Is that fair? Let's get a uniquely American solution to the health care costs so that we're not asking our companies to compete in a global economy.
You want the government to take over the health care system,
I do want our government to provide a level playing field.
For the last word of this, and I want to move on. Go ahead,
I'll just say this. If you look at how the textile industry was decimated in the South, if you look at how the furniture industry was decimated in the South, it didn't take a series of bailouts to restore them back to, again, in some cases losing pieces of business, in some cases actually growing market share based on change in the way that they were doing things. I would also say this. There's one report that we can all look at with regard to the automotive companies, and that's their share price. The markets have been saying what you're doing is not working, which is why the shares have continued to move south. And what's interesting is they came just a couple of months ago and said, look, if you just give us this money, we'll get restructuring done, and we'll be on our way to getting things right. Here they come back a couple months later asking for another $25 billion.
I want to go to another subject, the Fiscal Responsibility Summit the President's going to be holding tomorrow in the White House, and he's also going to unveil his budget this week. And we are told it is going to cut the deficit in half from where it is now to where it'll be in 2013, from $1 trillion to $533 billion, by letting the Bush tax cuts on the wealthy expire and by saving money by pulling troops out of Iraq. Governor Pawlenty, what do you think of the plan?
You asked earlier, why don't the markets like President Obama's plans, and you outlined the series of bailouts he's unveiled? Wait till you see the market's reaction to what he unveils later this week, which is increasing taxes in the middle of a deep, deep recession. I don't think it's going to be favorable. I also would concur with what was said earlier. If you believe they're going to take seriously the idea of cutting down the deficit when they are exploding spending at a historic pace, I've got some hunting land for you in northern Minnesota.
Governor Rendell.
Well, I guess it's amazing to me how we forget history. We heard these same arguments when Bill Clinton raised taxes on the top 2% of the richest people in America to get rid of the deficit. He got rid of the deficit, and guess what happened? We produced 24 million new jobs. We had the 8 years that were the most successful in the second half economically of the 20th century. So this rubbish that raising taxes on the richest people in the country is going to hurt our economy is just that. It's rubbish, and it ignores history. This is important. It's the way we're going to reduce this deficit, as well as getting troops out of Iraq, as well as being fiscally sound. All of us announced budget cuts. I cut $1 billion out of the Pennsylvania budget. I closed down 20% of the operating lines and programs. I think President Obama is going to do the same thing.
With due respect, say to my friend Ed, that I happened to be a member of Congress back then, and was the president there? Yes. Were there headlines at that time reading, "Is the presidency any longer relevant?" Because at that time you did have a Republican House and Senate that I think had a lot to do with that balanced budget.
But
what was interesting,
so did
certainly,
raising taxes.
But what was interesting is, no matter what was accomplished, it's simply the tip of the iceberg, because the operational deficit is a very small component of the larger deficit that this country has run with regard to Social Security, Medicare, and a whole host of different social payments.
Okay, finally, and you know we're going to have to do some politics here, I have a group question for all of you. Any of you willing to say that you absolutely, positively will not run for president in 2012, please raise your right hand. This is a trick question. I know you care saying it because of the fact that you're a Canadian-born, so you can't run, and you've got a president of your own party. I noticed that the two of you did not raise your hands. Governor Sanford.
Just because I would say this. My dad died of Lou Gehrig's disease when I was in high school. And the day you got's the day you got. It hit home for me how you take one day at a time. So is it a plan? Absolutely not. Is it a likelihood? Absolutely not. But I've learned that you never say guaranteed on tomorrow when you don't know tomorrow.
Is it something, because there's obviously been a lot of talk, and especially given the strong line you've taken against the budget, against the stimulus package, well, he's setting himself up for 2012.
Well, if you go back to those days in Congress, I took a lot of lonely votes back then tied to spending, and this is not exactly a new pattern for me.
Governor Pawlenty?
I'm going to make news right here on Fox News Sunday and tell you I am going to run for president of my Egan Youth Soccer Association. But
Man, for a second there, I was really excited.
Actually, I'm thinking about running for re-election for governor in 2010, and all of us are focused on this crisis. We've got people hurting across our states, and I would speak for all four of us and say we're not thinking beyond that and shouldn't be thinking
But you're not
beyond
ruling
that.
out 2012.
I'm first thinking about running for re-election for governor in the state of Minnesota, and that's my focus. And if I do, people would expect you to serve out that term.
I'll take that as a
maybe.
As a maybe, a definite maybe.
Think about that hockey association.
Yeah, well, you did
position.
for a minute there. You got my heart started. Governors, I want to thank you all so much for
Thanks
joining
so
us
much.
today and discussing all these issues. Later, our Sunday regular.